Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of those stories that starts with an ending. The moment the guns finally went quiet across Europe in May 1945, you've made it through 6 years of global chaos, and now you stand in the middle of it, wearing a torn grey uniform that suddenly means nothing. The war is over, the Reich is gone, and if we're being honest, you probably won't survive this next part, at least not unchanged. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your city and the time down in the comments, because I'm curious who else is lying awake with this story tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing somewhere in Germany, or maybe in Austria or Denmark, or the shattered outskirts of Berlin. The air smells of damp ash and spring mud. Birds are cautiously returning to the forests, but the sound feels too fragile against the ruin of Europe. Around you, tens of thousands of German soldiers are surrendering, some to the Americans, some to the British, and the unlucky ones to the Soviets. You can almost feel the relief seeping through your boots, mixing with dread. All across the continent, it's the same story. Convoys of exhausted men shuffle down roads lined with bombed-out trees. Helmets dangle from belts. Some carry wooden signs scrawled with "Nicht schießen, Kamerad," don't shoot, comrade. The word peace doesn't sound right yet. It feels more like an order you didn't volunteer for. A historical fact worth grounding yourself in. On May 8th, 1945, VE Day, Germany signed its unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was officially over. But for millions of German soldiers, that date didn't bring freedom. It brought a different kind of captivity. Roughly 11 million members of the Wehrmacht laid down their arms, and the Allies suddenly had the largest mass of prisoners in modern history to feed, guard, and somehow judge. You can imagine the chaos. Units that had been fighting to the death one day were calmly lining up to be disarmed the next. Some commanders gave tearful speeches, others simply vanished into the woods. The Allied radios crackled with disbelief, whole German armies surrendering at once, often to whoever seemed less likely to shoot them. You find yourself among them, just another soldier trying to figure out how to exist without orders. The first night after surrender feels surreal. Fires dot the horizon like distant camp beacons. There's an unspoken truce in the air, a mixture of shame and relief. Someone starts humming an old marching tune, softer than before. You lie down in the grass, hands behind your head, and for the first time in years, there are no planes above you. But don't let the quiet fool you. The end of the war doesn't mean the end of danger. Men are still dying of hunger, disease, revenge. And in this uneasy lull, nobody knows the rules anymore. Here's a quirky bit of reality that always catches people off guard. In the final weeks, many German soldiers actually fought each other to choose whom they'd surrender to. Units raced westward to reach the American or British lines before the Soviets arrived. Some even used captured jeeps or bicycles to make the dash. For those who didn't make it, who were trapped east of the Elbe, it often meant years of forced labour and the long silence of Siberian nights. Even in this moment of collapse, there's debate that still echoes among historians. When did the average German soldier truly know the war was lost? Was it after Stalingrad in 1943? After Normandy in 1944? Or only when Berlin fell and Hitler's voice went silent forever? Diaries from the time show a strange mix of loyalty, denial, and sheer exhaustion. Many soldiers described not understanding why they were still fighting, only that to stop felt unthinkable until someone told them otherwise. Now, as the night deepens around you, you see what that otherwise looks like. Columns of men moving west, their rifles tossed into ditches, tanks smouldering like relics of a dream. You pass a group of civilians staring blankly from the ruins of their homes. One old woman spits at your boots, another silently offers a cup of water. You take it, unsure which gesture wounds you more. The surrender isn't cinematic. It's slow, awkward, bureaucratic. Papers are signed in schoolhouses, barns, and half-destroyed factories. Flags come down in the rain. For each captured soldier, a tag number is written on a scrap of cardboard and tied to your collar. Your name becomes a record in some clerk's ledger, one among millions. Night falls. The sounds of engines fade, replaced by the chirp of frogs near a flooded field. You realise you haven't slept properly in days. You're not sure you even remember how. The war trained you to wake at every noise. Now the silence itself feels suspicious. You roll onto your side and think of home, if home still exists. There's a rumour passing down the line. The Americans give their prisoners cigarettes and bread. The Soviets, someone says, give them shovels. No one knows which story to believe, but everyone agrees on one thing. This is just the beginning of another kind of endurance. Somewhere an Allied officer scribbles a note that will become part of the massive logistical nightmare of the post-war years. Enemy personnel to be processed. That's you, a soldier with no army, no country, and no idea what tomorrow looks like. And as you close your eyes on that damp May night, the first full night of peace, it hits you that peace isn't something you just step into. It's something you survive your way toward, one uncertain day at a time. The next morning starts with mud, confusion, and the clatter of empty canteens. The sound of distant artillery has stopped for good. But now there's a new rhythm. Boots shuffling, voices muttering in dozens of dialects, the hollow ring of tin cups against mess tins. You're part of an endless column of prisoners stretching as far as you can see. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed uniforms, sweat, and spring earth. It's May, but the sky still feels grey and undecided. You walk with thousands of others toward the west. The road is littered with wrecked vehicles, horses left grazing by their fallen wagons, and the ghostly silence of towns that once mattered. You've traded your rifle for an armband marked PW, prisoner of war. It feels almost theatrical, like you're in some grim play where everyone forgot their lines. The Allied guards are jumpy. Some are American GIS barely older than you, eyes red from sleeplessness. Others are British, polite but wary. They shout orders in clipped accents. Keep moving. No talking. Hands visible. You obey automatically. Years of military training still rule your muscles. You glance sideways and realise that you and the man next to you, who once might have fought over a single trench, now walk in the same defeated rhythm. Here's a historical fact to anchor this surreal scene. After Germany's surrender, over 7 million German soldiers were captured by Western Allied forces in just a few weeks. The roads of Europe became rivers of grey-green uniforms moving westward. The Allied armies hadn't planned for so many prisoners. Their camps were overflowing within days. Every few kilometres the column halts. Guards count heads. A few men collapse from exhaustion. You see one quietly slip into the ditch, too weak to continue. Someone tries to help him, but a guard waves them on. There's no room for individual tragedies in this sea of surrender. Still, something unexpected happens among the prisoners. Some begin to joke, softly at first. A man behind you says, "At least we won't have to salute anymore." Another hums a tune, Schubert maybe. The sound is strangely comforting. You start to notice how quickly the instinct for survival transforms into the instinct for normalcy. Even in captivity, people start building little worlds. A song, a shared cigarette butt, a story about home. And speaking of stories, here's a quirky one. Some German soldiers tried to disguise themselves as civilians by swapping uniforms for farm clothes, or women's dresses scavenged from bombed houses. A few even pretended to be forced labourers from other countries, using scraps of foreign languages they'd picked up during the war. In one absurd case, a former SS officer spent weeks posing as a harmless accordion player in a Bavarian village before being recognised by his tattoo. The road keeps stretching on. You pass under trees where the leaves are a bright indifferent green. Every now and then, a group of Allied trucks rumbles by, carrying supplies or wounded men. One American soldier tosses a pack of cigarettes toward your line. A dozen hands reach out, and for a moment the crowd becomes a living wave of desperation. You catch a cigarette that rolls into the mud, wipe it clean, and tuck it into your pocket like treasure. There's an open, scholarly debate about what these first days of surrender really meant for the ordinary German soldier. Some historians argue it was liberation, a release from fear, propaganda, and endless fighting. Others insist it was humiliation, a complete collapse of identity. The truth probably sits uneasily between the two. You're not sure which side you'd agree with. At this point, you just want water and a place to sit. After 2 days of marching, you reach a makeshift holding area, just an open field surrounded by barbed wire. The guards herd you inside like cattle. The ground is trampled and the smell of waste is everywhere. Some men immediately dig small holes to lie in. Others scavenge branches to build lean-tos. There are no tents, no shelter, just an endless, restless mass of men staring at the horizon. You sit down and finally light that cigarette. The smoke feels harsh in your throat, but it steadies you. You think about the war. How you believed once that it might mean something. Now it feels like a fever dream. Around you, conversations bubble in half whispers. Do you think they'll feed us? I heard the Americans have chocolate. My brother surrendered to the British. Maybe he's safe. Night falls. The guards patrol the perimeter with flashlights. You lie back in the dirt staring at the sky, which is impossibly wide and full of stars. For the first time, you realise you don't have to listen for bombers. The absence of that sound is almost louder than the war ever was. Somewhere nearby, a man begins reciting a poem. Goethe, maybe, or Heine. His voice trembles but carries through the darkness, weaving something human through all this ruin. A few men join in, murmuring the lines they remember. It's a fragile sort of unity, built on shared exhaustion and memory. You think of home again, of the people who might be waiting or not waiting, or buried somewhere you'll never find. You picture a kitchen, a radio, a small clock ticking toward midnight. You imagine what they'll think when they hear the war is over, and in that thought something shifts. The war didn't end cleanly, it simply bled into another struggle, one of hunger, identity, and waiting. You close your eyes, realizing that surrender isn't a single act. It's a long process, one that starts with raising your hands and ends, if you're lucky, years later, when you finally feel human again. The dawn breaks pale and thin, washing the camp in colourless light. You wake up with the taste of dust in your mouth, and the ache of too many bodies packed together through a sleepless night. Around you, thousands of men are stirring, stretching, coughing, trying to make sense of this new kind of morning. Somewhere beyond the barbed wire, a jeep backfires, and the guards begin shouting for everyone to line up. This is your world now, a field, a fence, and the long wait for something, anything, to happen. The western camps are sprawling, improvised cities made of desperation. You've landed in one of them, run by the US Army somewhere along the Rhine. They call them Rheinwiesenlager, the Rhine meadow camps. You and nearly 2 million other German prisoners will call these muddy stretches of riverbank home for weeks, maybe months. The guards hand out ration tins of watery soup and bread hard enough to scrape your gums. No one complains aloud. You've seen worse. Still, your stomach growls with a kind of quiet fury. Around you, the men talk in low voices. There's a rumour that the Americans are just waiting for orders to send everyone back home. Another rumour says you'll all be shipped to France for labour. Another says the Soviets will come take their share. The camp itself looks like an unfinished thought. No barracks, no roofs, just trenches dug into the dirt where prisoners try to sleep under makeshift tarps or old coats. The spring rains turn everything into sludge. You find a patch of ground slightly higher than the rest and mark it with a stick. That's your spot now. You'd laugh if it didn't feel so absurd. Here's your historical fact for tonight. Between April and July 1945, the Western Allies held around 3.4 million German POWs in such open-air camps. The infrastructure simply didn't exist to house them all properly. The US and British armies had prepared for victory, but not for the sheer weight of surrender. Food, medicine and sanitation broke down under the strain. Mortality was officially low compared to the eastern camps, but disease and exposure still claimed thousands. You notice small economies forming almost immediately. A man with an old comb becomes the camp's barber. Another sells buttons and bits of wire scavenged from the fence. Cigarettes become currency. You trade one for a tin cup. A fellow from Bavaria offers you a handful of wild onions he found near the riverbank. They taste sharp, but for a moment, you feel alive again. There's a strange civility in this chaos. The guards, mostly Americans, try to maintain order. Some are kind enough to toss extra bread over the wire. Others bark orders like drill sergeants from another planet. You hear one say, "These guys are just farmers and kids," while another mutters, "Let them rot, they started it." You can't argue with either. Every evening the guards switch shifts, and you catch glimpses of their routines. Card games, laughter, radio music floating faintly through the dusk. You listen to a swing tune drifting from a jeep's speakers, and it stings more than any insult. You remember when music sounded like that for you, before it all went wrong? Here's a quirky fact you wouldn't expect. In some Western camps, American soldiers organised impromptu baseball games within sight of the POW. Sometimes the prisoners would cheer or boo like spectators, momentarily forgetting the wire between them. A few guards even taught curious Germans the rules, an accidental cultural exchange in a field of mud and shame. As the days stretch into weeks, you lose your sense of time. Meals, roll calls, the occasional interrogation, they're the only markers now. You overhear one prisoner say he used to be a teacher, another was a violinist before the war. You realise that the men around you, stripped of rank and insignia, are a random cross-section of a broken nation, some fanatics, some dreamers, most just ordinary. The open scholarly debate that follows you into this chapter is about responsibility. Were all these soldiers guilty in some way, even if they never pulled a trigger in anger? Or were they simply caught in a system that devoured everyone, believers and doubters alike? Historians still argue where the moral line should have been drawn. You, sitting in the dirt with your empty tin, can only feel the question in your gut. Sometimes you think of the past with dangerous clarity. The front lines, the comrades lost, the cold nights in ruined cities, it all feels sharper now than it did then. You catch yourself missing the structure, the purpose, even the illusion of control. Captivity has a way of magnifying emptiness. One evening rain returns. It comes softly at first, then hard enough to blur the landscape into grey watercolour. You huddle under your coat, water dripping down your neck. Around you, men curse, laugh, and try to cover their heads with anything they can find. A few start singing, an old marching song turned into a dirge. The sound rises and falls like waves. You close your eyes and let it wash over you. In the morning, the ground is a swamp, but the sky's clear again. The camp stirs with quiet determination. Someone builds a tiny stove from a tin can. Someone else carves a chess set out of twigs. You realise that even here people can't stop creating. It's what keeps them human. At sunset, the guards line you up for another count. The light turns golden, catching on the wire and the distant river. You feel, for the first time, something that almost resembles peace. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the faint recognition that you're still alive, and maybe that's enough for tonight. You wake to the rumble of engines that don't sound American. The guards are tense, their voices sharper this morning. Whispers ripple through the camp. Transfers are happening. Men are being sorted, some west, some east. Nobody wants to go east. Everyone's heard the stories. The Soviets don't do POWs, they do punishment. A truck pulls up near the wire, and an officer reads a list of names. The chosen men climb aboard silently, clutching their few belongings. You watch them go, wondering if you'd rather face another muddy month here or disappear into the red horizon. It's not much of a choice, but tonight we're following those who went east, beyond the comfort of chocolate and swing music, into the world of Soviet captivity. If the Rhine camps were limbo, the Soviet camps are something colder, deeper, almost mythic in their cruelty and endurance. The scene shifts. You're no longer standing in a field in Germany. You're on a train, one of hundreds of trains that snake eastward from the shattered cities. The windows are boarded up. The air inside the cattle car is thick and sour. You can barely move. Someone coughs, someone prays. Outside, the spring air gives way to a dull, endless landscape that looks like it's been waiting centuries for this kind of misery. Here's your historical anchor for this grim journey. Of the roughly 3 million German soldiers captured by the Red Army, about a third would never return. Many were sent to forced labour camps spread across the Soviet Union. Mines, logging camps, factories rebuilding what the war destroyed. Official Soviet records mention 2.4 million prisoners. German sources claim up to 3.3 million. The truth lies somewhere between the ledges and the snow. You travel for days, maybe weeks. There's no sense of time, only the steady clack of wheels and the gnawing hunger that turns men silent. When the doors finally open, the air is cold enough to burn your lungs. You're herded out onto a platform dusted with frost, your breath clouding the air. A Red Star flag flaps in the wind. A Soviet officer barks something about "work for the motherland." You don't need translation. The camp you enter is ringed with barbed wire like the others, but here everything feels harder, older. Watchtowers loom against a grey sky. Inside, rows of wooden barracks lean against each other like tired giants. The air smells of smoke and wet wood. Someone hands you a tin bowl and a spoon. You hold on to them like they're sacred relics. Days blur into a rhythm of labour. You wake before dawn to a whistle, march to the work site under armed escort, chop wood or dig ditches until your arms feel detached from your body. Then back to camp, soup of cabbage water and black bread, lights out. Over and over, time becomes mechanical. Here's a strange, almost unbelievable fact. Some German prisoners in Siberia ended up teaching their guards how to play classical music. Others organised small theatre troupes, performing Goethe and Schiller to keep their sanity. One Soviet guard reportedly wept during a makeshift Christmas concert in 1946, whispering, "Even our enemies have souls." That moment, fleeting as it was, survives in a few diaries smuggled home years later. At night, the cold creeps through the cracks in the barracks. You wrap your coat tighter, if you still have one. Some men share body heat, pressing close without shame. Others tell stories about their homes, Hamburg, Dresden, the Black Forest, as if reciting a map to stay human. You can feel the boundaries between nations dissolving here. Nobody cares who was a general or who was a farm boy. Hunger erases rank faster than any revolution. You've become part of a massive wordless brotherhood of endurance. Historians still argue about Soviet motives. Some say it was pure revenge, a way to balance the monstrous suffering Germany had inflicted on the East. Others insist it was economic. The USSR needed labour to rebuild, and POWs were the cheapest resource available. The truth, again, probably lies in the messy middle, revenge wearing the mask of practicality. One evening you're too tired to eat. You stare at your bowl of soup until it cools into a thin, shimmering film. A man across from you, he was a baker before the war, slides his portion toward you without a word. You shake your head, but he insists. That small act of kindness feels heavier than any medal you ever earned. In spring, the work changes. You're sent to a lumber camp in the Urals. The trees there are enormous, their trunks straight as church pillars. When you strike the axe, the sound echoes forever. Sometimes you imagine the forest whispering to you in Russian, as if it knows every secret of defeat and forgiveness. A quirky story from this period. Some Soviet captors, weary of guarding men who were too exhausted to escape anyway, began letting small groups wander into nearby villages to trade handmade trinkets for food. A carved comb could buy you a boiled potato. Occasionally a local woman would hand over bread with a silent nod. Pity doesn't have a language barrier. Months pass. The seasons change, but the dream of home doesn't fade. It just becomes abstract, like a word you once knew, but can't quite pronounce anymore. You hear rumours of men being released, others dying suddenly of illness. Hope becomes a dangerous thing to hold. One night, during a snowstorm, you lie awake listening to the wind scrape against the roof. You think about the millions of others scattered across the east, each one a flickering ember of the same extinguished fire. You realise that the war hasn't really ended, it's just changed its setting. When morning comes, you wake to find the snow sparkling under a pale sun. It's beautiful in a way that hurts. You breathe it in, that impossible cold, and tell yourself that somewhere west of here, rivers are thawing, bells are ringing, and maybe, just maybe, someone still remembers your name. It's the first real morning where the horizon isn't fenced. You're no longer a POW, at least not officially. You've slipped away, and your boots are carrying you through the early summer mist of 1945, deeper into a landscape that doesn't yet know who won. You're one of the lucky few who escaped. Lucky, of course, being a word that feels flimsy when your whole body hums with fear. Behind you the camp fades into the grey dawn. Ahead the Alps rise like a jagged promise. You don't have a map, just a rumour. If you reach the mountains, the war disappears. It sounds like superstition, but superstition's all you have left. The path twists through pine forests heavy with rain. Every snapping branch makes you flinch. A historical fact to ground this ghostly trek. In the weeks after surrender, an estimated 700,000 German soldiers went missing. Not killed, not captured, just gone. Some hid in the forests and ruins. Others slipped into civilian clothes, hoping to vanish before the Allied patrols swept through. The southern German mountains, especially Bavaria and Austria, became a kind of twilight zone of fugitives, deserters, and lost souls. You move at night, sleep by day. Once you find a shepherd's hut with a loaf of stale bread inside. You eat half and leave the rest for whoever comes next. Another night you meet two others on the trail, a boy barely 18 and an older man missing 3 fingers. You don't ask names, you just share silence and the occasional cigarette. There's something oddly peaceful about being nobody. No orders, no insignia, no ideology, just breath and footsteps. You start to remember simple things. The smell of wood smoke, the shape of clouds, the quiet between heartbeats. Freedom, it turns out, is terrifying precisely because it's so empty. A quirky, almost cinematic truth. After the surrender, entire groups of German soldiers staged fake funerals to disappear. They'd bury empty coffins marked with their names, then flee south using forged death certificates. A few even joined wandering circus troupes or monastery kitchens, blending into post-war Europe's patchwork chaos. Somewhere in the archives, you can still find payrolls listing Brother Josef, or Hans the Juggler who once wore the eagle and swastika. Days blur. You reach the foothills. The air smells of wildflowers and melting snow. You see American trucks on the roads below, but up here, only cowbells and birds. One evening, you shelter in a barn with a local farmer's help. He doesn't ask questions, just gestures toward a haystack and mutters, "The war's over, no need for more ghosts." You sleep deeper than you have in years, but not everyone's lucky. You stumble across the remains of an old skirmish. 3 dead men in half-burned uniforms, their pockets turned out by looters. You take nothing except a canteen and a button that reads "Gott mit uns." The phrase feels almost ironic now, glinting in the dirt. The next village you pass through is full of uneasy silence. Women scrub soot from door frames. Children watch you with wide eyes but say nothing. You can see suspicion and exhaustion woven into every face. For them, the war hasn't ended either, it's just moved indoors. You trade your field jacket for a patched coat and your cap for a wool hat. Now you're just another refugee. It works. Mostly. A British patrol questions you once, but you answer in broken English, saying you're from somewhere else, anywhere else. They wave you along. You don't breathe again until you're miles away. Here's where historians still argue. How many of these missing soldiers truly disappeared into civilian life? Some estimates say hundreds of thousands successfully melted into the new Germany. Others insist that most were eventually rounded up or reported. But then there are those who never re-emerged. Men who changed names, moved abroad, or simply kept walking until they belonged to no country at all. You find work for a few weeks helping clear debris from a mountain road. The pay is food and a place in the hayloft. At night, you listen to the wind sweep through the pines. You start carving a spoon from a branch just to keep your hands busy. The rhythm of the knife against wood feels like a heartbeat. Then, one evening, a group of Allied soldiers passes through. They're Americans again. Tired, polite, curious. One of them offers you a cigarette. He doesn't ask who you are. He just says, "Hell of a mess, huh?" You nod, and for a brief second there's no victor, no vanquished. Just 2 men sharing the same stunned quiet after the storm. A quirky survival tale that fits this moment. One former Luftwaffe pilot famously lived in a cave near Berchtesgaden for over a year after the surrender. Locals brought him bread and milk and he became a legend, the ghost of the Alps. When he finally walked into town in 1946, no one arrested him. They just said, "You can stop hiding now." Eventually you realise you can't stay here forever. The war may have ended, but time hasn't. The world is already moving on, and you're still a shadow in the trees, so you climb higher one last time, reaching a ridge where the view stretches for miles. The valleys, the rivers, the tiny villages where life is flickering back to normal. You stand there, breathing thin air, and understand something no speech or tribunal will ever capture. Survival isn't about victory or guilt. It's about learning how to keep walking when the world you belong to no longer exists. Below you, bells ring from a church that somehow survived everything. The sound drifts upward, light and fragile. You let it wash through you and think, maybe, just maybe, you can learn to belong to silence. You wake before dawn to the sound of paper and boots, the shuffle of bureaucracy. The air tastes of dust and ink instead of gunpowder now, and the war's new weapon is the typewriter. Welcome to denazification, the grand sorting of souls. The Allied powers have decided the time has come to cleanse Germany, not just its cities but its people, and you, weary and unshaven, are about to find out what that means. A jeep rolls into the village square, loudspeakers crackling in German. All former members of the Wehrmacht report to the Rathaus for processing. It's 1946, and the new command loves that word. Processing. You button your borrowed coat, join the trickle of men filing toward the hall, and try to ignore the civilians watching from their doorways. Some glare, others look away, embarrassed by your existence. Inside, the hall smells of wet coats and bureaucracy. Desks line the walls, manned by Allied officers and German clerks wearing armbands labelled Control. Everyone clutches the same set of papers, questionnaires printed in English and translated awkwardly. Were you a member of the National Socialist Party? What rank? Did you ever attend a rally? Did you believe in Adolf Hitler? You stare at the questions, realising that every answer feels wrong. Here's a solid historical marker for you. Between 1945 and 1951, the denazification program processed about 13 million Germans, trying to separate the major offenders from the followers. In reality, it was chaos. Too many forms, too few judges, and an entire nation pretending not to recognise itself. Most people were eventually categorised as Mitläufer, those who went along. It became the word everyone clung to, the grey zone where guilt and survival blurred. You're handed a pencil and told to fill out the form truthfully. You hesitate over the question about party membership. You were conscripted. You never joined voluntarily. But will anyone believe that? The man beside you, a former sergeant, mutters, "Just write number." Everyone writes no. He smirks, but his hand trembles as he fills in the blank. A clerk collects your paper, scans it quickly, and stamps it with a word you can't quite read. Then you're directed to another table. Interrogation. The officer here is young, American, polite in that detached way. His German is fluent but mechanical. He asks where you served, what you saw, what you knew about the camps. The word Konzentrationslager hangs in the air like smoke. You say you never saw one. That's true, technically. He nods but doesn't look convinced. Here's a quirky footnote that rarely makes the documentaries. Some of the Allied interrogators were German exiles who'd fled during the 1930s and returned wearing American or British uniforms. Imagine answering for your country's crimes to someone who'd once lived down your street, and whose parents you may have helped persecute without even knowing it. History, as it turns out, loves irony. When it's over, you're handed a stamped paper declaring you temporarily cleared for civilian work. It feels like a parole slip. You step outside into the pale daylight, holding the document like it might dissolve if you breathe too hard. The square is quiet except for a woman selling bread. She eyes your uniform trousers, then your face, then looks away. That night you sit in a makeshift dormitory. An old schoolhouse now filled with cots. Men trade stories about their hearings. One claims he convinced the Americans he was a baker's apprentice, not a soldier. Another brags about hiding his medals under a barn floor. You listen without comment. You've learned that truth has become a kind of luxury now, something you can't always afford. Historians still debate whether denazification ever really worked. Some argue it was vital, a moral reckoning that forced Germany to confront its conscience. Others see it as political theatre, a bureaucratic purge that punished the unlucky and let the useful slip through. By 1948, even the Allies were weary of it. The Cold War was heating up, and suddenly, yesterday's enemy looked like tomorrow's ally. In the weeks that follow, you're assigned to reconstruction duty. It sounds noble until you realise it means clearing rubble from bombed streets. The work is endless but oddly therapeutic. You spend your days stacking bricks and thinking about how many versions of Germany lie buried beneath the debris, one for every person pretending they weren't part of it. One afternoon, a British officer supervising the crew stops to chat. He offers you a cigarette, lights it for you, then asks, "Do you think people can really change?" You exhale slowly, watching the smoke curl upward. "Maybe," you say, "but not on paper." He nods, like he's been waiting for someone to say it out loud. Here's a small, strange fact. The Allies actually used psychological tests, ink blots, word associations, to evaluate some former officers' democratic potential. Imagine trying to rebuild a conscience by guessing what a stain looked like. It's the kind of well-intentioned absurdity that only peacetime could invent. Evenings are the hardest. The radio plays jazz, foreign and unmoored. You lie on your cot and study the stamped paper again. It's supposed to be your path back to normal life, but you can feel the invisible label it carries. Ex-soldier, possibly guilty, tolerated for now. You wonder how long that shadow will stretch. The next morning you're sent to assist with record-keeping. The irony doesn't escape you. You, who were just interrogated, now alphabetizing other people's files. The names blur into one another. Müller, Schmidt, Weber. You can't help but notice how many papers carry the same phrase, claimed ignorance of political activities. By lunch, it reads like a national anthem. When your shift ends, you walk through the ruins to the river. The city smells faintly of wet stone and new grass. Across the water, children are playing in the rubble, turning bomb craters into castles. For a moment, you think, maybe this is what denazification really is. Not forms or tribunals, but the quiet insistence of life returning, even when nobody's ready for it. The sun sets behind the cranes, the sky streaked orange and grey. You drop your stamped paper into your coat pocket and start walking home, wherever that is now. The wind carries the sound of hammers, and for the first time, it doesn't remind you of gunfire. It just sounds like rebuilding. By the time you reach the American zone, the world has found a rhythm again. Half ruin, half rebirth. The borders of post-war Germany are like uneven stitches holding together a patient that might not survive the surgery. You step off a transport truck somewhere near Frankfurt, your stamped paper crumpled in your pocket, and realise you've traded one uniform for another kind of order. Occupation. The Americans are everywhere. Their trucks, their language, their music. You can smell coffee in the air, a scent so alien after years of ersatz brew that it almost hurts your nose. Neon signs flicker to life in the towns they've occupied, and the word Coca-Cola glows brighter than the street lamps. It's 1946, but the American century has already begun. Your first assignment in the US zone is labour reconstruction. The phrase sounds generous, but it mostly means fixing what your country broke. You're handed a shovel, a ration card, and told to report to a work detachment near Wiesbaden. The supervisor is a cheerful lieutenant from Ohio who calls everyone buddy. He grins when you salute him. No need for that anymore, pal. And that's the strangest part. You keep waiting for punishment, for someone to remind you of what you've done, but the Americans treat you more like a stray dog they've decided to adopt. They're firm but oddly casual about authority. You catch yourself liking them sometimes, which feels almost treasonous. Here's your grounding historical fact. By late 1945, roughly 2 million German POWs were working for the Western Allies in Europe. In the US zone, these men rebuilt bridges, cleared mines, repaired railways, and harvested crops. The Geneva Convention technically protected them, but reality was improvisational. Food was scarce, but better than in the Soviet camps. Discipline was strict, but rarely brutal. You and a few dozen others spend your days repairing roads and unloading supplies. The Americans pay you in food coupons and cigarettes. You learn that a pack of Lucky Strikes is worth more than cash, good for bartering with locals who crave anything foreign. By your second week, you've traded 2 cigarettes for a pair of real leather boots and half a bar of soap that smells like citrus and envy. At night, you sleep in a converted warehouse. The guards are young, talkative, they play baseball outside the barracks, and sometimes they invite a few of you to watch. You don't understand the game, but the rhythm of it, the cheers, the crack of the bat, feels almost sacred. One private tries to explain the rules in broken German. You pretend to follow, though mostly you're mesmerised by how easily they laugh. A quirky slice of reality. In several US-run camps, GIS actually formed friendships with German POWs. Some exchanged addresses, photographs, even music. A few American soldiers who'd studied German before the war became interpreters and ended up drinking with their former enemies on quiet evenings. The war's lines were dissolving faster than anyone expected. You start learning English from overheard phrases. You bet. No kidding. Take it easy. The language feels like it's built for optimism, smooth and quick, like it refuses to dwell on bad memories. You try it out once, saying, "Take it easy," to a corporal as you pass him. He laughs, slaps your shoulder and says, "Now you're getting it." There's still structure, though. Roll call, curfews, inspections, and the daily moral weight that hangs over every camp like morning fog. You've seen the photographs by now, the camps, the emaciated bodies. Some prisoners call them propaganda. Others don't speak at all. You can't decide which silence you belong to. Historians still debate this part of the story, the psychology of coexistence between conqueror and conquered. Was the American leniency a calculated strategy to pacify the population, or simply an accidental byproduct of pragmatism and youth? The archives suggest both. The GIS wanted to go home, the Germans wanted to survive. It turned out those goals weren't so different. One evening, you're unloading timber from a truck when a US sergeant waves you over. He hands you a cup of real coffee, black, steaming, fragrant. You sip it carefully, almost reverently. He says his name's Jack. You tell him yours. He squints and says, "Hard name to spell." You both laugh, and for a brief second, history feels negotiable. Weeks turn into months. You earn small privileges, a day pass into town, a seat in the canteen instead of standing in line outside. You wander through streets lined with rubble and jazz. American military police direct traffic where statues once stood. Children beg in English now, saying chocolate instead of brot. One Sunday, you attend a church service just to hear music again. The chaplain's sermon is about forgiveness, but what really catches you is the choir. Voices rising through the rafters, raw and unpolished. You don't believe in redemption yet, but you recognise its sound. That evening, back in the camp, Jack tosses you a magazine. The cover shows smiling families and shining cars. Life magazine, it's called. You study it by lamplight, tracing the clean lines of an imagined world, one untouched by war. You wonder if such a place can really exist, or if it's just another kind of propaganda, softer and better lit. Here's a quirky afterthought that historians love. Some of those very POWs who rebuilt the American zone later emigrated to the US in the 1950s. A few even wrote letters to their former guards, thanking them for showing how to start over. The ironies of peace are quieter but no less strange. When winter comes, the Americans issue wool coats and thicker blankets. Snow gathers on the camp fence like lace. You look through it at the forest beyond and realise that the line between captivity and freedom is starting to blur. You work, you eat, you sleep, you laugh sometimes. You are, against all odds, still human. The day ends with a familiar phrase from Jack as he flicks off the lights in the barracks. "Take it easy, buddy." You lie there in the dark, repeating it under your breath. It sounds almost like a prayer. You transfer north in spring, following a convoy of trucks to what used to be the British zone. Lower Saxony, maybe, or the edge of Schleswig-Holstein. The signs are in two languages now, English and a clumsy German, painted on wooden planks by tired hands. You've grown used to the rhythm of these journeys. Count the boots, keep your head down, listen for laughter that doesn't belong to you. The British camps have a different texture, tidier, quieter, more restrained. If the American camps felt like noisy summer carnivals fueled by cigarettes and jazz, the British ones feel like boarding schools with fences. You're handed a cot, a bowl of porridge, and a rulebook translated into painfully polite German. Please refrain from attempting escape, as it may cause unnecessary misunderstanding. Your days start with tea, not coffee. That alone tells you the Empire has its own ways of taming chaos. You and 100 others are assigned to civilian repair work, a phrase that means everything and nothing. Mostly it's clearing roads, digging trenches and helping rebuild bridges under the drizzling northern rain. Here's your historical anchor for tonight. By the end of 1945, the British held roughly 3.6 million German POWs, both inside Germany and across the British Commonwealth, from Norfolk to Kenya to Canada. In the home camps like this one, they were fed better than civilians but worked harder. Many ended up rebuilding the very towns their bombs had flattened only a few years earlier. The worksite smells of wet earth and motor oil. The British foreman, a lanky man named Carter, addresses you in brisk syllables. "Right then, lads, let's make this look like England again, shall we?" You can't tell if he's joking. Still, there's something almost comforting in his clipped rhythm. He talks to you like you're part of a project, not a punishment. At midday, the workers rest under a half-collapsed bridge. Someone passes around a tin of condensed milk, a luxury beyond words. You dip a finger into it, sweet and sticky, and for a moment you're transported back to childhood, long before uniforms and flags. The British have rules for everything: punctuality, cleanliness, queue order. It's maddening at first, but soon you start to understand. It's how they make sense of victory. The camp library even lends books. You pick one at random, a tattered Dickens novel. You don't understand every word, but you read it anyway, mouthing the sentences aloud like a spell. Here's a quirky historical footnote. Some British officers believed POWs could be re-educated through culture. They organised lectures, theatre plays, even cricket matches. You once watched a group of bewildered Germans trying to bowl a cricket ball under Carter's tutelage. "No, not like that," he cried, half laughing, half despairing. You couldn't tell which side was being rehabilitated, the prisoners or the guards. Evenings bring a kind of muted civility. The guards share their newspapers, and you sit beneath the tarpaulin reading headlines about rationing, coal shortages, and Winston Churchill's speeches. It's strange to think the victors are still hungry too. You overhear one British soldier mutter, We may have won, but we can't afford it. The sentence stays with you. The open scholarly debate that hangs over this period is whether the British treatment of German POWs was driven by principle or pragmatism. Officially, they adhered to the Geneva Convention. But with food scarce and Europe in ruins, the line between humane detention and exploitation blurred daily. You can feel that ambiguity in every shovelful of earth you move. Occasionally you're allowed into nearby towns to help with reconstruction. Civilians stare at you, their expressions mixed. Curiosity, resentment, pity. In one small village, a widow offers you a cup of tea after you fix her garden wall. She doesn't speak much, just says, "You did terrible things." You nod and answer, "Yes." It's not confession exactly, more like weather acknowledging rain. Another quirky detail from these camps, the British Guards sometimes hosted talent nights. Germans recited poetry, played accordions, even performed magic tricks. You remember one evening when a thin man named Klaus did a card trick so flawless the guards applauded. For a few minutes the war evaporated into sleight of hand. Your bunkmate, a former schoolteacher, tells you he's started writing again. Short essays about what he calls Nachkriegsmoral, the morality after war. He believes that rebuilding isn't just physical, it's spiritual. You tell him that sounds naive. He just smiles and says, "So is survival." Historians later note that British camps became some of the first places where re-education experiments took root. They played BBC radio programmes designed to teach democracy, even broadcasting the Nuremberg trial so the prisoners could hear justice in real time. You and the others listened in silence. When the verdicts came, death, life sentences, you felt neither satisfaction nor outrage, just fatigue. As months stretch into years, the routine softens you. You learn to measure time not by battles but by harvests, repairs, the slow rhythm of rain. You even develop a taste for weak tea and canned peas, small absurdities that somehow mean stability. Then, one afternoon, Carter announces that some of you may soon be released. He calls it repatriation, a word that sounds both promising and suspicious. You've almost forgotten what home is supposed to mean. That night, lying in your bunk, you think about how strange it is that the war's final lesson is patience. You once believed survival was a matter of courage. Now you know it's endurance, quiet, and slow. You listen to the drizzle on the tin roof and imagine it as applause for a play that's run too long but refuses to close. When sleep finally comes, you dream not of battlefields, but of neat English gardens, orderly, damp, endlessly green. You can't tell if you're longing for peace or simply another kind of captivity, one with better manners. The train jerks to a halt somewhere in the south of France. You blink awake, the air suddenly thick with sunlight and the heavy scent of pine. For a moment it feels like you've arrived in paradise, until the doors slide open and you see the guards waiting, rifles slung casually, cigarettes glowing in the corners of their mouths. Welcome to the French camps. The heat hits like a slap. The sky's impossibly blue, the kind of blue that mocks your exhaustion. You and hundreds of other prisoners climb down from the boxcars, bones stiff from days of travel. There are palm trees nearby, and a distant shimmer of the Mediterranean. You almost laugh. It looks like a holiday brochure for someone else's life. A French sergeant with rolled-up sleeves waves a clipboard and shouts for order. His accent slices through the murmuring, "Travail," reconstruction, work. You understand that word all too well. The group is divided quickly, some to vineyards, some to road repair, others to stone quarries. You end up in the vineyards because someone decided you look like you knew plants. You don't, but you nod anyway. Here's your grounding historical truth. In 1945, France held roughly 900,000 German POWs, many loaned from American custody. They were used for labour in agriculture, industry, and reconstruction. France, ravaged and humiliated by occupation, saw this as both justice and necessity. Officially, the prisoners were protected under the Geneva Convention. In practice, conditions varied wildly, from humane to harrowing. The vineyard is in Provence, near a village that smells of thyme and smoke. Rows of vines stretch toward the horizon, their green leaves trembling in the dry wind. The work is back-breaking. You dig, prune, haul, under a sun that feels like vengeance. But the food, surprisingly, isn't terrible. The farmer's wife brings out bread and soup at midday. She watches you with a gaze that's not unkind, just cautious. There's an unspoken rule here. Don't speak about the war. The villagers lost brothers, fathers, sons. Some were in the resistance, some vanished in German camps. You sense that they've already decided what you are. A necessary ghost. Still, the routine softens over time. You learn enough French to say merci and pardon. You learn to tie vines properly so they don't break under their own fruit. A quirky and little-known fact. In southern France, German POWs were often adopted informally by local farmers who needed hands to rebuild. Some of those relationships lasted for years. There are even records of POWs who married French women after their release, choosing to stay in the same villages where they once toiled. War ends, hunger doesn't, and neither does the strange chemistry of shared need. One evening, after weeks of work, the farmer's wife hands you a small cup of wine. "For your effort," she says in halting German. You hesitate, then drink. It's tart and dry, the taste of soil and sun and forgiveness measured by the sip. You realise how far you've travelled from the snow and fences of the East. Here, the punishment feels almost gentle, but you know it's still punishment. Historians argue about France's motives. Was this retribution disguised as rehabilitation, or simply economic necessity? The French government called it la récupération morale, moral recovery through labour. Some saw it as poetic justice, Germans rebuilding what Germans had destroyed. Others saw it as exploitation under a polite label. You can't decide which version you're living. One afternoon, while pruning vines, you cut your hand. The farmer himself, stoic, sunburned, wraps it with a strip of linen. "You bleed red," he says quietly. You don't know whether it's a joke, an accusation, or both. Days slide into months. The seasons mark time better than any calendar. Summer burns, autumn cools and sweetens the air. You help crush grapes barefoot, the juice staining your skin purple. It feels absurdly human, almost joyful, to be doing something that turns pain into wine. You catch yourself humming while you work and stop, embarrassed. A quirky anecdote from the archives. In 1946, a group of POWs in Burgundy started an unofficial choir. Their voices carried over the hills, and locals began gathering to listen from a distance. Eventually the villagers joined in. The French guards didn't stop it, they just leaned on their rifles, pretending not to notice harmony growing out of revenge. At night, you sleep in a stone barn with a dozen others. Someone has painted a crude mural on the wall. A house, a woman, a tree. It's the kind of drawing a child might make, which somehow makes it more devastating. The farmer's dog sometimes sneaks into sleep at your feet. You wonder if that's mercy or habit. By winter, you've learned to understand more French than you speak. You catch words like liberté and avenir, freedom, future, floating through the villagers' conversations. They sound almost mythical, as if belonging to another species. You dream in fragments now, half German, half something else. The open scholarly debate about this era centres on memory. How did two nations, one occupied, one defeated, learn to live side by side again? Some say it was through silence, others through labour, maybe both. You think silence is easier? It leaves fewer scars on the tongue. In early spring, rumours spread that repatriations will begin soon. Some men cheer, others stare into the dirt, uncertain whether home is a blessing or another sentence. You realise you've grown attached to this place. The vines, the rhythm, the predictability. You've built something fragile, usefulness. On your last day at the vineyard, the farmer shakes your hand. His palm is rough, the gesture hesitant but real. Bonne chance, he says. Good luck. His wife gives you a small loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. You nod, unsure how to thank her properly, and start walking toward the transport trucks waiting by the road. The sky is orange with sunset. The rows of vines gleam like lines in a poem you'll never forget. You look back once, knowing you'll probably never see this place again. Then you turn toward the trucks, toward the next uncertainty, feeling the dust rise beneath your boots. And for the first time, you realize that freedom, like wine, is something that has to ferment slowly, painfully, before it's worth tasting. You think you're going home. That's what the French guard told you when he loaded you into the truck. Almain, Almain. But as the convoy rolls east, the roads turn rougher, the language changes, and soon you realise that home is stretching farther and farther away. You cross into Soviet territory, though no one says it aloud. Someone mutters a prayer, another curses quietly. The air thickens with dread. Welcome to the long odyssey eastward, the one that makes even hardened men shiver. The train cars are old cattle wagons again, packed so tight you can barely move. The trip lasts days, maybe weeks. You lose count. The windows frost from the inside. At every stop, a few bodies are pulled out and replaced with silence. When the train finally stops for good, the sign reads something unpronounceable in Cyrillic, the kind of name that feels like a sentence. You've arrived in the Soviet Union. The guards shout instructions you can't understand, and you stumble out into a landscape that looks endless. Grey soil, skeletal trees, sky like a sheet of dull steel. Someone says this is near Minsk, someone else says farther east. Nobody knows, and it doesn't matter. Here's your grounding historical fact. Between 1945 and 1949, more than 2.5 million German soldiers were held in Soviet camps across Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Siberia. Official Soviet statistics list around 380,000 deaths, though Western researchers estimate closer to 1 million. The survivors called themselves Heimkehrer, the returners, but for many that return took a decade. Your camp is called Vorkuta, or maybe Tambov. They blur together anyway. The buildings are wooden barracks half buried in snow. You're handed a number, a spoon, and a piece of black bread that crumbles like ash. The work begins the next morning, hauling logs through waist-deep snow, clearing tracks for coal trains that will never stop here. You learn to move mechanically, to save breath for breathing. At night, inside the barracks, the men huddle around a tiny stove made from an oil drum. It radiates more hope than heat. You listen to the crackle of the fire and the coughs that never stop. There's an unspoken rule: never count the living after sunrise, only the dead. A quirky but real detail. In some camps, German prisoners crafted chess sets and instruments out of scrap wood and wire. They played symphonies to no audience but themselves. Music became rebellion, the only kind the guards allowed because they didn't understand it. In Vorkuta, it's said, a violin made from a bedpost once echoed across the tundra, stopping even the guards in their tracks. You keep your head down and work. The Soviets are unpredictable, sometimes generous, sometimes violent. One guard smuggles you an extra potato, another beats a man to death for stealing coal. It's a roulette of mercy and cruelty, and you learn not to look anyone directly in the eye. There's a strange equality here, though, an erasure of past hierarchies. Former SS officers share bunks with conscripted farmhands. Nobody wears rank anymore. Hunger is the great democratizer. The only status left is endurance. Historians still argue about the purpose of these camps. Were they about vengeance, ideology, or necessity? The Soviet narrative claimed moral rehabilitation through labour, anti-fascist education, they called it. The prisoners called it survival education. Every blow of the hammer was a lesson in humility. Every sunrise was a lecture on the meaning of patience. In spring, the snow melts, turning the camp into a swamp. Mosquitoes rise in black clouds. You trade your coat for lighter rags, though the cold lingers even in sunlight. Food rations improve slightly. Cabbage soup with actual cabbage. Men start talking about home again, daring to remember. Someone carves a calendar into the wall, marking each day like a small act of defiance. You dream of rivers, not the icy ones here, but those of Germany, the Rhine, the Elbe. In your sleep you can almost hear them, wide and forgiving. When you wake, the only sound is the wind moaning through the barbed wire, a quirky anecdote buried in Soviet archives. Some German POW doctors were conscripted to treat Russian civilians, especially in famine-struck areas. In return, they received extra food for their patients. One wrote later that it was the first time I felt like a man again, not a number. You wonder if he ever made it home. Years blur. Men are transferred, released, replaced. You stop asking when it will end. The Soviets hold war crimes trials even here, in the camps. The accused are paraded in front of everyone, forced to confess, often to things they didn't understand. You watch once, then never again. By 1948, whispers spread. Some prisoners are being sent home. It sounds like myth until one day a guard reads out names, and a handful of men vanish through the gates clutching their ration bags. You tell yourself not to hope, but you can't help counting days again. The scholarly debate about this period is tangled in politics. Soviet historians insist that rehabilitation was successful, that the prisoners returned purified. Western scholars counter that it was survival, not repentance. The truth, as always, sits in the frost between those arguments, a generation that learned morality from hunger, not ideology. One winter night, you wake to silence thicker than snow. The guard towers are still, the wind calm. You step outside, breath clouding in the moonlight. The forest around the camp glows faintly, as if the stars have fallen just out of reach. You realise you've stopped fearing death. What frightens you now is the thought of returning to a world that won't recognise you. You whisper a name, you're not sure whose, and the sound vanishes into the trees. Somewhere beyond this frozen horizon, the world is rebuilding, arguing, loving, forgetting. You stand there a little longer, then go back inside, lying down among men who breathe like ghosts. Tomorrow will be work again, and maybe, just maybe, another sunrise that belongs to you. You finally make it back to Germany in 1949, or what's left of it. The train that brings you west rattles past landscapes that seem both familiar and alien. Cities you once knew are still skeletal, half-standing cathedrals, burned-out blocks, the ghosts of streetcars. People wave as the train passes, not with joy exactly, but with the polite disbelief of those who assumed everyone on board was already dead. When you step off at the small station near your hometown, the air smells of coal smoke and new bread. You stand still, almost afraid to breathe. After years of mud, snow and foreign words, the sound of German, your German, hits you like a punch. It's softer now, quieter, as if the language itself is ashamed. You walk home, or toward where home should be. The streets are different, smaller somehow. The corner bakery is gone, replaced by a heap of rubble sprouting weeds. You pass a boy kicking a tin can. He stares at your sunken face and keeps walking. The sky is low, grey with drizzle. You wonder if the clouds look the same as they did before the war, or if even the weather carries the memory of it. When you reach your old address, you find a stranger's name painted on the doorframe. The building still stands, but your mother is gone. Died in 44, a neighbour says during an air raid. The neighbour doesn't invite you in. You stand there a long time, hat in hand, listening to the sound of rain hitting the cobblestones. Here's your grounding fact for tonight. Of the 11 million German soldiers who served during the war, about 4 million were captured and roughly 3 million died. By 1950, millions of families were still waiting for word, letters that would never come. The returning POWs like you, Heimkehrer, were both pitied and mistrusted. They came home to a country that no longer existed, carrying silence heavier than their duffel bags. You find a room at a boarding house. Pay with the few ration tickets you still have. The landlady eyes your uniform remnants and asks, "You from the east?" You nod. She says nothing more, but leaves extra bread on your plate that evening. It's the kindest thing anyone's done for you in years. The town feels caught between amnesia and guilt. People talk about shortages, about rebuilding, about the Americans bringing chocolate and Marshall Plan money. No one talks about the war unless it's to say, "We had no choice." You listen, realizing that everyone has rehearsed that sentence like a prayer, a quirky fact buried in post-war records. German newspapers began publishing homecoming personals, small classified ads where wives and mothers listed the last known details of missing men. Some were written like love letters, others like epitaphs. Kurt, last seen near Danzig, please come home. The pages became daily memorials, each line a thread between the living and the lost. You visit the churchyard one Sunday and find your family's grave. Your mother, your father, both dates ending in the war years. Someone's planted marigolds there. You kneel in front of the stone and realize you have nothing to say, not even a prayer. The silence between you feels earned, like two sides of the same wound. Historians call this period the moral reconstruction. The Allies called it re-education. The Germans called it starting over. But there was no manual for coming home after becoming a ghost. Psychologists now speak of collective trauma, but you just know it as the quiet that follows every question. You find work clearing debris in a nearby city. The pay is small, but it keeps your hands busy. Sometimes when you lift a stone, you find bits of burned photographs or melted toys. You start saving them in a box as if rebuilding someone else's memory will help patch your own. One evening, you meet a woman named Lotta who runs a small cafe for workers. She's younger than you, practical, her hands always dusted with flour. She doesn't ask about the war, only says, "You look like you could use a proper meal." You end up washing dishes for her in exchange for soup and coffee. After a few weeks, she starts saving you the end pieces of cake that customers leave behind. You tell her she's wasting food. She tells you to stop being dramatic. There's laughter again. Awkward, fragile, but real. It feels strange to hear it come from your own mouth. Here's a quirky anecdote from those years. Returning POWs often formed singing groups to raise money for their towns. They sang old folk songs, war ballads reworded into laments. Sometimes they were joined by Allied soldiers still stationed nearby. The idea that music could rebuild trust seemed absurd, and yet, somehow, it worked. By the end of 1950, you've built a routine. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. The body remembers stability long before the mind does. But sometimes, while sweeping the cafe floor after closing, you look out the window and see men in worn coats, still wandering, still searching for homes that don't exist. You feel the old ache rise again, the guilt of being one of the few who returned. There's still a debate, even among the survivors, about what redemption means. Some think it's confession, others think it's silence. You suspect it's simpler, showing up every morning, doing something that isn't destruction. One night, Lotte asks if you'll help her paint a new sign for the cafe. You agree, though your hands still tremble when holding a brush. As you paint the word Heimat, home, she stands beside you, humming softly. For the first time, the word doesn't sound like nostalgia or irony. It just sounds like a place you might someday belong to again. When you finish, she smiles and says, "That's good." Strong lines. You smile back and realise that for the first time in a decade, no one's given you an order. It feels like forgiveness, or at least the first draft of it. The mornings are quieter now. You wake not to sirens or shouted orders, but to the smell of bread baking in Lotta's cafe downstairs. The air carries that warm yeast scent through the wooden floorboards, mingling with the faint hum of the city outside, a city still patching itself together, brick by careful brick. You lie there for a while, letting the peace feel unnatural before you rise. It's 1951. Germany has been split down the middle for 2 years, east and west, like two halves of a broken mirror that refuse to reflect the same face. You're in the western half, where American cigarettes and optimism circulate like currency. The radio talks about democracy and economic miracle, Wirtschaftswunder, as if prosperity could erase memory. But you know memory doesn't disappear. It just hides behind routines. At breakfast, you pour coffee for Lotta and a few regulars, construction workers, a teacher, a nurse. They talk about the price of bread, the new currency, the latest movie from Hollywood. Nobody mentions the war anymore. That's the rule everyone learned silently. You can talk about everything except the years between 1939 and 1945. You follow the rule too, mostly, until the day she walks in. Her name is Marta. She's wearing a grey coat too heavy for the season, her hair pinned in a hurry. She stands at the counter for a long moment before ordering. "Coffee, black," she says, her voice flat, the kind that carries both education and fatigue. You pour, noticing the small tattoo on her wrist. Numbers. Faded, but unmistakable. The world tilts slightly. She sits near the window, staring out while the cup cools. When she finally meets your eyes, there's no accusation. Just recognition. You look down, suddenly fascinated by the saucer in your hand. Lotta watches the exchange quietly, sensing the tremor between you two. No one says anything, but the silence sharpens. Here's your grounding historical truth. By the early 1950s, survivors of Nazi camps were returning too, to Germany, to Poland, to France. Some came back searching for lost relatives, others to testify in war trials. Their presence made post-war Germans uneasy, the living reminders of what everyone else was trying to forget. Conversations froze when they entered rooms, just as yours has now. You set the cup on Marta's table and whisper, "It's on the house." She studies you, not kindly but not cruelly either. "You were one of them," she says softly, almost as a fact. You nod once. She takes a sip, winces at the bitterness and says, "So was my brother." That's all. Then she leaves the coins anyway, neatly stacked beside the saucer. You stand there a long time after she's gone, the coins gleaming like small verdicts. Lotte touches your arm gently. You don't have to be anyone's enemy anymore, she says. You want to believe her, but forgiveness isn't a switch, it's sediment. It settles slowly, unevenly, over time. That evening the cafe is quiet. You clean the counters, lock the door and sit by the window. Outside, the streets are dotted with neon lights and men in new suits, walking like the future's already here. But you notice something else. Women in uniforms, brisk and efficient, their eyes trained straight ahead. A historical footnote worth lingering on. By the early 1950s, Germany's Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, had become national icons. They cleared the wreckage by hand, rebuilt cities stone by stone. They were the backbone of the recovery, often while their husbands, brothers or sons were dead, missing or imprisoned. For them, the war never ended. It just changed uniforms. You see them every morning on your way to work, scarves tied tight, arms scarred from labour, laughter rare but strong. Sometimes you think they're the real soldiers of the post-war years. Lotte, too, is one of them, her apron the colour of surrender and persistence all at once. Then there's another kind of woman entirely, the Fräulein Wirtschaft, the new women of the rebuilding years. They work in offices, smoke cigarettes, talk about independence. Some were once auxiliaries in the army, communication officers, nurses. When the war ended, they faced interrogation, suspicion, or worse. Society didn't know what to do with women who'd worn uniforms. They were neither heroes nor victims, just inconvenient evidence of a complicated past. A quirky fact: in the British zone, some of these former auxiliaries joined translation programs for the occupation forces, helping to rebuild administrative systems. Others reinvented themselves entirely as teachers, secretaries, or fashion designers. One former Luftwaffe radio operator became a cabaret singer in Hamburg, performing songs about loss wrapped in velvet sarcasm. Her stage name? Mona Luft. History has a sense of humour, if not mercy. The debate that still follows those women is about complicity. Were they victims of circumstance or active participants? The truth, as with the men, is blurred. You remember faces from the war, clerks, nurses, drivers, all believing they were serving something noble. Belief, you've learned, can be its own uniform. One evening Marta returns. This time she sits at the counter. You look tired, she says. You almost laugh. What else could you look like? She tells you she's teaching at a nearby school for displaced children. You don't ask what kind of children. You know, she says, they're learning new words now. Freedom, democracy. I still have trouble pronouncing them. You nod. So do you. You pour her coffee again, stronger this time. She takes it without sugar. The silence between you isn't hostile anymore. It's just human, fragile, shared. When she leaves, she says, maybe I'll come back. You answer, you should. You don't mean it as penance. You mean it as possibility. Later that night, you find yourself writing a letter. Not to anyone in particular, just to the part of you that stayed behind in the camps, or the part still waiting at that ruined doorstep years ago. You write one sentence. We're learning how to live without forgetting. You fold it neatly, tuck it under the sugar jar at the cafe and blow out the lamp. The city hums outside, alive with the small sounds of rebuilding. Footsteps, engines, laughter. You close your eyes, and for the first time the noise doesn't make you flinch. It feels like breathing. Morning fog curls along the riverbanks as freight trains rattle past, carrying timber, coal and secrets. The country hums like a vast construction site. It's 1952, and West Germany is crawling toward prosperity, while its shadows stretch longer behind it. You walk through this strange new piece every day, hands deep in your coat pockets, eyes down. But peace, you're learning, has its own ghosts. Some of them never came home at all. You first notice the posters tacked to lampposts and cafe walls. Vermisst, Gefreiter Karl Hoffmann, last seen east of Breslau, 1945. Missing. A face in black and white, a name printed neatly below. They're everywhere, tens of thousands of them like silent census records of absence. You pause at each one, reading the eyes, trying to see yourself in the blank spaces. Here's your grounding fact. By 1955, more than 1 million German soldiers were still listed as vermisst, missing in action. Some were buried anonymously, some trapped in Soviet camps, and others Others had simply decided not to return. Across Europe, there were whispers of men who'd slipped into new lives, sometimes in disguise, sometimes under mercy's cover. You hear rumours constantly. A man in Hamburg claims to have seen his old commanding officer running a bookstore in Zurich. Another swears a friend from the Eastern Front became a truck driver in Argentina. Letters circulate, unsigned, describing tropical climates and new names. The border between rumour and resurrection blurs so easily in post-war air. Then one afternoon, while sweeping the front step of Lotta's cafe, a customer drops a newspaper on the table. The headline catches your eye. Former Wehrmacht officer found living in Brazil. You read it twice. The article says he'd married, had children, built a farm. He told the reporter, "I wanted to see what life looked like when it wasn't trying to kill me." You sit with that sentence longer than you should. That night, Lotta finds you staring at the wall. She asks, "What's wrong?" You answer honestly, "Some people get to start over completely." She shrugs. "Maybe that's worse." Then you spend the rest of your life pretending the past never spoke your name. You know she's right, but you envy the idea of vanishing anyway. A quirky little truth. After the war, South America became an improbable refuge for ex-soldiers of all ranks. Argentina, Chile and Brazil saw entire communities of Germans setting up bakeries, schools and churches under the Southern Cross. Not all were fugitives. Some were just men who couldn't face the grey skies of home again. Historians call it the quiet diaspora. Meanwhile, Germany keeps unearthing its ghosts. Trains from the east still arrive sporadically, carrying skeletal men in threadbare coats, the last of the Heimkehrer from Soviet camps. Crowds gather at stations, hoping, praying. Every arrival is part miracle, part autopsy of hope. You volunteer 1 week to help with the Red Cross registration tables at the rail yard. You stand among the shouting, the sobbing, the reporters scribbling notes. One man collapses as soon as he steps off the train. Another just sits on the platform staring at his shoes. They smell of coal and foreign winters. You offer them water, bread, a cigarette. Small currencies of compassion. A man with hollow cheeks grips your wrist suddenly. "Do you know my wife?" he rasps. You shake your head. He stares at you for a long moment, as if you might still deliver her name from your own mouth. "Then maybe she's still alive," he says. You nod. It's the only answer that doesn't break him. Historians still debate the psychology of those who never returned versus those who did. Which group bore the heavier burden? The men who vanished, or the ones forced to live as witnesses? The statistics don't measure that kind of arithmetic. You suspect survival has more equations than solutions. At the cafe, Lotta keeps a small box behind the counter filled with lost letters, postcards addressed to men long dead, delivered decades too late. The mail still wanders, like the people who sent it. One evening she shows you one, a postcard from 1944, never opened, sent to Lieutenant Emil H. The back reads, "Come home soon. The cherries are almost ripe, no return address." You run your fingers over the faded ink and feel the weight of someone else's unfinished sentence. That night, you walk down to the river where barges drift slowly under the bridges. The city lights shimmer across the water. You realise how many versions of Germany are buried beneath the one you live in. One for the dead, one for the missing, one for the survivors. You belong to all three, which means you belong nowhere completely. There's a small monument near the riverbank now, an iron figure holding an empty helmet. At its base, a plaque reads, "To those who never returned, but are not forgotten." You read it and think how strange memory is. It keeps everyone alive, but never quite whole. A quirky and haunting post-war story. In 1952, a German fisherman near Rostock hauled up a helmet tangled in his nets. Inside was a letter sealed in wax, perfectly preserved by salt water. It was addressed simply to Mother. The note inside said, "If this reaches you, I am already gone, but I am not lost." The fisherman turned it over to the authorities. No one ever found the sender's name. The letter is now in a museum, labelled Unknown Soldier, found 1952. Sometimes, at night, you imagine all the missing men scattered across the earth, living under palm trees, or buried beneath snow, or haunting old roads in the east. You wonder if you'd recognise them if you met them now. Would they still speak your language, or has time translated them into silence? You dream of them often, not as soldiers but as shadows walking home, endlessly late but still on their way. In the dream, you're among them, marching quietly through fog that smells of bread and rain. No one speaks. No one needs to. The road goes on forever, but at least it's homeward. When you wake, dawn is seeping through the curtains. Lotta's downstairs humming again, the coffee percolator bubbling softly. You sit up, heart steady, the dream fading but not gone. You realise that maybe the missing never truly disappeared. They just found another kind of country, made entirely of memory and unfinished stories. And for the first time, you don't envy them. You simply wish them rest. By 1953, Germany's newspapers hum with new words. Korea, atomic, Eisenhower. And yet under the headlines, old ghosts are being quietly hired. You notice it one morning in a small column buried beneath an ad for refrigerators. German scientists recruited for American research project. The article says they'll be working on aviation technology. You know what that really means. Welcome to the strange moral twilight of Operation Paperclip, though no one calls it that here. The Americans, it seems, have decided that genius outweighs guilt. You read the article twice, wondering whether it's worse to be forgotten or forgiven for the wrong reasons. A historical truth to anchor this chapter. Beginning in 1945, the US secretly transported more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians, many of them former members of the Nazi war machine, to work on military and aerospace programs. Werner von Braun, the man behind the V-2 rockets that terrorized London, ended up designing rockets for NASA. His new project's name would echo ironically across the stars, Saturn. You first hear the rumours from a regular at the cafe, a former university student turned journalist. He says they've brought them to America. The same men who built the bombs for Hitler are now building rockets for freedom, he laughs bitterly. History has a short memory when it needs talent. You stir your coffee, unsure whether to feel outrage or relief. Maybe this is what survival really means, being useful again, no matter the cost. At night, the cafe radio hums with reports about the Cold War heating up. There's talk of the Soviet atomic program, of spies, of scientists defecting east or west. You imagine those same men sitting in air-conditioned American offices, wearing suits instead of uniforms, sketching blueprints for the next war under a new flag. A quirky, almost absurd fact. One of those scientists captured in Bavaria reportedly told an American officer, "I prefer working for the winners." Another, when asked how he felt about joining the US Army, replied, "I never stopped being a scientist. Governments come and go. Gravity stays." You suppose that's one way to rationalise morality, but the secret isn't really secret anymore. Whispers spread through cafes and universities. Von Braun is in Huntsville. Another one's in Texas, teaching jet propulsion. Did you hear about the neurologist who experimented on prisoners? He's consulting for the Air Force now. The rumours blur fact and paranoia, but everyone agrees on one thing. The Allies are building the future out of the ruins of the past. One afternoon, a customer leaves behind a foreign magazine with glossy pages showing a smiling von Braun beside an American general. The caption reads, "From war rockets to moon dreams." You flip through the photos, scientists shaking hands, factory floors gleaming. You wonder if they ever think of Peenemünde, of the slave labourers who built their rockets beneath the earth. Or if success burns clean enough to erase memory. Historians still debate the morality of Paperclip. Some argue it was pragmatic, a necessary race against Soviet science. Others call it hypocrisy at its purest. Documents declassified decades later would confirm that US officials deliberately whitewashed records, rebranding Nazi engineers as potential assets. The ink of their new resumes dried faster than the graves in Dora Mittelbau, where tens of thousands of forced labourers had died building the V2. Lotta shakes her head when you tell her. So the world spins forward, she says, on engines built by men who never had to look backward. You nod, thinking how progress often smells faintly of amnesia. A quirky local echo of all this. In 1953, West German universities quietly began rehiring professors dismissed for party membership. The phrase, entlastet, reintegrated, appeared in official records. Within a few years, half of the nation's civil service would consist of men who had once sworn oaths to Hitler. Bureaucracy, it seems, is as reusable as steel. Still, the world loves redemption stories more than reckonings. The Americans rename their program Project Hermes. The Soviets, not to be outdone, parade their own captured German scientists through Moscow's research centres. The race for the future begins on the same rails that once carried prisoners east. You lie awake at night listening to the radio buzz through static. A newsreader says the Soviets have launched a new test rocket that reached the stratosphere. He calls it a triumph of modern science. You close your eyes and imagine a thin silver streak cutting through the night sky. Beautiful, terrifying, built from the bones of everything that came before. The next morning, a boy in the cafe window stares up at the contrails left by Allied jets passing overhead. "Someday," he says to his mother, "I'll fly to the moon." You watch him, realizing that innocence is the best camouflage history ever invented. The scholarly debate that follows this chapter of humanity is about whether evil can be repurposed for good. Can knowledge born of atrocity become clean when pointed at the stars? Philosophers argue both sides. Engineers shrug and build the next prototype. You just pour coffee and listen to the hum of an espresso machine that sounds vaguely like an engine warming up. One evening you find yourself writing another letter you'll never send. "We're all working for someone now," you write. "Some for bread, some for redemption, some for the moon." You fold the paper and slip it into your coat pocket, unsure whether you're condemning the world or forgiving it. Outside, the city glows brighter than ever. New streetlights, new cinemas, new faith in progress. People point upward at the sky, counting stars like promises. You tilt your head too, following the contrails that stretch toward a horizon you'll never reach. Somewhere beyond them, the same engineers who once built instruments of terror are sketching the blueprints for space capsules. Somewhere else, a Soviet scientist who once stood opposite them is doing the same. You can't help thinking how small the planet must look from above. All those borders and bodies and histories blending into one long line of smoke. The world has decided to forgive itself through innovation. You sip your coffee, staring at the faint steam rising from the cup, and think, maybe that's the only kind of absolution humanity ever really manages, turning its guilt into fuel. The winter of 1953 comes with a new kind of noise. The low murmur of trading, the soft clink of bottles, the whispered shuffle of deals. You hear it first outside the cafe one night. Two men arguing in the alley over cigarettes and canned meat. Voices low but urgent. The war is long over, but the black markets haven't died. They've just gone respectable. The official economy hums in daylight. Factories rising, wages growing. But in the shadows, a parallel one thrives. You see it everywhere. A woman selling American soap for twice its price. A boy trading chocolate for nylon stockings. Ex-soldiers hawking binoculars, medals, old pistols polished to look new. The rubble's turned into currency now. Nostalgia's just another commodity. You finish sweeping the cafe floor and step outside into the crisp night air. The smell of coal smoke mingles with perfume and cheap tobacco. In the corner of the square, under a broken lamppost, a crowd gathers around a man spreading trinkets on a blanket. Pocket watches, dog tags, fountain pens. You recognize one of the tags immediately. The eagle and swastika have been scratched off, but not perfectly. The past is still visible if you tilt it toward the light. Here's a solid historical fact. In the years between 1945 and 1955, black markets formed the backbone of survival across post-war Europe. In Germany, they were called Schwarzmarkt. Cigarettes replaced currency. Allied chocolate replaced gold. The official ration system crumbled, and even as recovery took hold, the habit of trading outside the law persisted. For many veterans, this underground economy was their first and only way back into relevance. You walk closer to the man's stand. He grins when he sees you looking. "You were one of us, ja?" he says. His accent is Bavarian, his smile too wide. He picks up a medal, rubs it with his thumb and says, "They'll pay more for this now than they ever did in Berlin." You shake your head. "You're selling ghosts," you tell him. He shrugs. Ghosts spend easily. A quirky footnote from this era. Some of those trinkets, uniform buttons, badges, insignia, were later bought by Allied collectors or tourists. What had once been symbols of terror became souvenirs. There's a strange comfort, apparently, in owning a piece of history when it's safely dead. The market grows bolder as the night deepens. You see men in coats exchanging documents, foreign bills, even gasoline coupons. Somewhere nearby, someone's playing a harmonica, a tune you half remember from the front. You stop for a moment, caught between memory and melody. The harmonica stops abruptly when a police whistle cuts through the air. The crowd scatters. You step into the shadows and wait, heart pounding for reasons that have nothing to do with guilt. By the time the noise dies down, the street's empty again. You find a single cigarette left behind on the cobblestones, slightly crushed but still smokable. You light it, the ember flaring orange in the cold air, and think about how fragile legitimacy really is. One generation fights a war, the next one sells its relics. Lotta hates the black markets. They keep people looking backward, she says, wiping down a counter with the same intensity she uses to avoid conversation. If you can still trade on the past, you'll never stop living in it. She's right, of course, but you can't help understanding the temptation. Some people rebuild, others collect. Here's an oddity historians love: the trimmer literature, or rubble literature, emerging in these same years. Writers, many of them former soldiers, began turning their experiences into stories, some bleak, some defiant. Their characters drifted through bombed-out cities trading watches for bread, and truth for survival. In a way, they were documenting the same black market of morality that you now witness daily. The cafe becomes an unofficial meeting spot for traders and thinkers alike. Journalists, construction workers, former officers, all passing envelopes and whispers. Lotta tolerates it because business is business. Coffee doesn't care who drinks it, she says. Still, you sometimes catch her watching the door like she's expecting trouble. One night, a man sits at your counter wearing an overcoat that looks too new. He orders schnapps and leans closer. "You ever want to make a little extra money?" he asks. You keep your face blank. "Depends what kind of money." He slides a small object across the counter. A silver watch. Old, but pristine. "Find me a buyer," he says. "Someone who appreciates craftsmanship." You recognize the insignia faintly engraved on the back. It's military. Old Germany. You slide it back. "Try the pawn shops," you tell him. He grins, pocketing it. Pawn shops ask questions. You don't. Then he leaves, the bell above the door jingling like punctuation. You lie awake that night thinking about all the trades people are still making. Souvenirs for silence, shame for survival. It's a marketplace without moral boundaries, and you wonder if that's what peace really looks like. The freedom to profit from forgetting. The open scholarly debate around this time revolves around the ethics of memory and reconstruction. Should post-war Germany erase its symbols to heal, or preserve them as warnings? Some say selling them trivializes history. Others argue that turning them into commodities is the final act of disempowerment. You aren't sure which argument wins when you see a boy using an old helmet as a flower pot in his mother's window box. By the early 1950s, the black market begins to fade as the economy stabilizes. Factories reopen, wages rise, and new currencies, both literal and moral, take over. But the habit of quiet exchange never really dies. It simply changes form. The same people who once sold cigarettes in alleys now trade information, influence, futures. The deals are cleaner now, but the hunger behind them hasn't changed. One evening you find a single forgotten dog tag among the cafe's receipts. You don't know how it got there. The name is almost rubbed away, but you can still read the blood type and the word Glaube, faith, etched faintly near the edge. You carry it to the river and toss it in. The splash is small, swallowed instantly by the current. On your way back, the neon lights flicker on across the square, bright red and blue, promising entertainment, prosperity, distraction. You pause and glance at your reflection in the window of a shop displaying shiny radios. For a moment, the ghost looking back at you seems almost content. Then the lights blink, and it's gone. You turn toward the cafe, the warm smell of bread drawing you in. Behind you, the city hums with transactions invisible and eternal. Peace, you think, has its own kind of battlefield. It's just quieter, more polite, and fought with smaller weapons, words, prices, memories. The cafe radio buzzes one grey morning in 1946, crackly voices echoing from somewhere far grander than your small street corner. The words come through with the solemn rhythm of history being performed. Defendant, stand. The tribunal will hear your final statement. You turn up the volume and the entire cafe goes still. Even the spoons stop clinking. Nuremberg. It's not the war anymore. It's the aftermath trying to make sense of itself in front of microphones. You and Lotta lean closer as an interpreter's voice translates testimony into flat, exhausted German. The names roll by like thunder. Göring, Hess, Keitel. Men once spoken about with awe or fear, now reduced to suits behind glass, pleading for context. Here's your grounding fact. Between November 1945 and October 1946, 24 of the highest-ranking Nazi officials were tried by the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg. 12 were sentenced to death, 7 to prison, 3 acquitted, 2 never made it to the end. It was the first time in modern history that following orders was publicly stripped of moral cover. You listen to hours of testimony condensed into headlines. The cafe regulars argue in low voices. Some say it's justice, others call it theatre. An old man in the corner mutters, "They can't hang the whole country." No one answers him. At night you imagine the courtroom, the smell of polished wood, the cold echo of translators' booths, the clicking of typewriters preserving every word for posterity. You picture the defendants sitting beneath that enormous Allied emblem, their faces pale under the bright lights, the cameras flashing like judgment itself. A quirky, almost cinematic truth. The courtroom had to be specially rewired so that translators could work simultaneously in 4 languages. Each defendant wore headphones. It was the birth of modern simultaneous interpretation, language becoming infrastructure for morality. Progress built right atop atrocity. Weeks pass, verdicts approach. You read every scrap of newspaper you can find. Göring's suicide the night before his hanging feels both predictable and theatrical. The rest go quietly. You don't cheer. You just note how quickly history becomes procedure once the bodies are still. Historians have argued about Nuremberg ever since. Was it justice or victor's justice? The Allies themselves weren't spotless. Dresden still smoulders in the collective conscience. Yet without those trials there would be no template for accountability, no vocabulary for genocide. Law itself had to evolve just to catch up to the scale of what had happened. The cafe fills with debate for weeks. Young students quote philosophy, Kant, Nietzsche, Sartre, words like moral agency tossed around as if they weigh less than bread. You listen, thinking how easy it is to analyse evil once it's safely confined to photographs. One afternoon, a British officer, an occasional customer, tells you he attended part of the proceedings as a courier. "Do you know what struck me most?" he says. "They looked so ordinary." Like any civil servants, really. That's what evil sounds like when it's bored. You can't tell if he's confessing or warning you. Meanwhile, smaller tribunals spring up across the country. Dachau, Hamburg, Lüneburg. Hundreds of former guards, camp officials, doctors, bureaucrats, all standing in rooms filled with evidence no one wants to hear. Some are convicted, many aren't. The records pile high, then quietly fade into archives. Justice, like rubble, is unevenly cleared. A quirky detail from those lesser-known trials. Defendants often arrived in freshly pressed suits donated by Allied officers, so they'd look civilized in court. The symbolism was unintentional but perfect, dressing guilt in the garments of order. You attend one hearing yourself in a nearby district hall. A former officer is accused of ordering civilian executions in 1944. The witness is a farmer's widow. Her voice trembles but never breaks as she describes the day her husband was shot. The room is cold, and you notice the defendant's hands shaking as much as hers. When the verdict comes, 10 years imprisonment, the widow simply nods and leaves. You wonder if that's what closure looks like, just walking out. Historians still debate whether Germany's post-war justice went too far or not nearly far enough. Some say it cleansed the nation, others argue it merely quarantined the worst offenders, while the rest resumed business under new stationery. The truth is, morality doesn't scale well. It's made for individuals, not empires. Back at the cafe, life presses forward. The radio moves on to new stories. Marshall Plan aid, the Berlin blockade, the latest American films. But every now and then, someone brings up a rumour. Another trial, another escapee. You pour the coffee, keep your face neutral, and realise that justice, like caffeine, wears off faster than you'd hope. One night, Marta comes in again, the survivor with the numbered wrist. She sits quietly, listening to the radio replay an excerpt from the final judgment. Crimes against humanity. Such atrocities as have no parallel, she says almost to herself. They'll say it was the end of evil. But it was just the intermission. You look at her hand resting on the counter, the faint tattoo catching the light. Maybe the next act will be smaller, you offer weakly. She shakes her head. No, just more efficient. Then she finishes her coffee, pays, and leaves without looking back. Later, after closing, you sweep the floor and think about all the words used to define guilt. Tribunal, evidence, culpability, repentance. None of them sound like healing. They sound like filing. The world has learned how to categorize monsters, but not how to live with the memory of them. Outside, the snow starts to fall, quiet, impartial, covering everything evenly. Ruins, rebuilt walls, graves. You watch it through the window until the glass fogs from your breath. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls midnight. You count each strike and think how strange it is that time, of all things, remains unpunished. The radio announces it in that crisp official tone you've learned to mistrust. West Germany is founding a new army. You're sitting at the counter, polishing cups, when the words land like a stone in a calm pond. Bundeswehr, the announcer says, a new name for an old profession. Around you, the cafe falls silent, then bursts into murmurs. It's 1955, 10 years since surrender. You'd thought uniforms were gone for good, that the last of them were packed away in basements or burned behind barns. But now the Americans and British, those same liberators, want a German army again. Smaller, cleaner, democratic. The Cold War has changed everything. Here's your grounding fact. The Bundeswehr was officially established on November the 12th, 1955, under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. Germany, now divided into East and West, became a pawn-turned-partner in the global chessboard. Former Wehrmacht officers, once prisoners, once suspects, were quietly recruited to train the next generation. The uniforms were new, but the men inside often weren't. The first to comment is Hans, the retired policeman who drinks coffee every morning at the corner table. So, we're soldiers again, he says with a bitter laugh. History's just changing uniforms. Someone else replies, better our own army than the Soviets rolling in. The room splits instantly into low, tense debate. You keep listening. A man you've never seen before, young, clean-shaven, too confident, leans on the counter and says, my father's rejoining. He says it's different now. He'll wear the eagle again. You nod, unable to hide the tremor in your jaw. The eagle, yes. But this one's supposed to face west now, wings softer, head turned toward democracy. The symbolism feels fragile, almost pleading. At home that evening, Lotta reads the headline aloud. Germany to defend the free world. She sighs. Free world? It always needs defending, doesn't it? You tell her maybe it's necessary. She gives you a look sharp enough to slice through the rhetoric. They said that last time too. A quirky historical footnote. The Bundeswehr adopted not only new insignia, but a new oath, one that pledged loyalty not to a leader or a state, but to the basic law itself, Germany's new constitution. I swear to protect the rights and freedom of the German people, it began. A radical idea for a country where obedience once outweighed conscience. The recruitment posters arrive within weeks. They're printed in bright colours, young men in crisp field uniforms, smiling beside helicopters, shaking hands with American officers. You see one pasted to a wall near the train station. Serve peace, protect freedom. You stare at it longer than you mean to. The boy in the poster looks like someone you might have been if history had started later. By summer you hear the boots again. Not marching this time, just practicing in neat, cautious rows at the edge of town. You walk there one afternoon out of morbid curiosity. The drills look familiar but strange. The salutes have changed, the songs are gone. The officers wear polite expressions like bank clerks who've been handed rifles by mistake. You realise you're watching a country trying to learn how to be dangerous responsibly. Here's a quirky fact from the archives. Some of the first Bundeswehr soldiers refused to carry weapons during training. They wanted to prove they were defenders, not aggressors. Others insisted on studying philosophy and ethics as part of their service. An army that wanted to think, perhaps the greatest irony of all. Historians later call this period the moral experiment of the West German soldier. Could you rebuild a military without resurrecting militarism? Could discipline coexist with democracy? The debates filled parliaments, newspapers and beer halls alike. You hear them nightly in the cafe, arguments bouncing off the walls like ping-pong balls. One evening Marta walks in again, the teacher, the survivor. She looks at the newspaper headline on the counter and says, "Another army?" You nod. They say it's for peace. She smirks faintly. That's what armies always say. Maybe this time they'll mean it. She stirs her coffee, then adds softly, "Just promise me they'll learn to aim their conscience first." You tell her that's what they claim. New soldiers, new code, new country. But even as you say it, you remember how easily words can be uniforms too, neatly pressed, spotless, ready to wear. A curious statistic buried in later reports. By 1957, nearly 40% of Bundeswehr officers were former Wehrmacht members. Some of their records had been revised to ensure acceptability. Men who once served one empire now served another, trading insignia for ideology. For them, redemption came with a salary and a salute. You hear whispers of old divisions resurfacing, arguments about honour, betrayal, victimhood. "We were just soldiers," one man says at the counter. "We fought for Germany, not Hitler." Another fires back. "Then why didn't you stop him?" The air tightens. Lotta steps in with a pot of fresh coffee, like a referee waving a white flag. At night, you take a walk through the half-rebuilt streets. You pass a recruitment office lit by fluorescent bulbs. Inside, a young man in uniform leans over paperwork, pen moving quickly. You catch his reflection in the glass. It overlaps with your own for a moment. Two soldiers from different wars, one beginning, one refusing to end. You turn away first. Historians now argue that this moment, the birth of the Bundeswehr, was the true test of Germany's rebirth. Could a nation haunted by its uniform ever wear one again without shame? The answer, decades later, seems to be only by never forgetting. You pause on a bridge, the river below catching moonlight like a thin blade. Somewhere far east, the Soviet tanks still sit ready, their engines silent but waiting. Somewhere west, Americans toast to democracy with bourbon and optimism. And here, in the quiet in-between, you wonder which way the new army will face when history asks again. Back at the cafe, Lotta leaves the radio on low volume overnight. The announcer is describing the swearing-in ceremony of the first recruits. They pledge loyalty to freedom, not to conquest. You listen to their voices echoing faintly through static, repeating the oath in unison. You find yourself whispering along with them, not because you believe every word, but because you want to. The sound fades into the soft clatter of morning dishes, the city yawning awake, and for a fleeting second you think, maybe rebuilding isn't about starting over. Maybe it's about learning to carry the weight of the past without collapsing under it. By the late 1950s, reunions begin sprouting like spring weeds across the country. Tiny gatherings at first, then larger ones, always in the back rooms of beer halls or rented town halls, still smelling faintly of disinfectant and nostalgia. They call them Kameradschaftstreffen, comrades' meetings, and if you've ever wanted to witness memory rehearse itself as theatre, this is the ticket. You receive your invitation on a plain postcard one morning. The handwriting is hesitant, as if even the ink is unsure. Old unit gathering in Kassel. Come if you can. No uniforms. It's signed simply Ernst. You remember him, one of the men from your first posting back when you still believed wars had rules. You stare at the card for an hour before folding it neatly into your coat pocket. When you arrive in Kassel, the city looks brand new, all glass and steel. The bomb scars have been plastered over with optimism. The reunion is in a beer hall tucked behind the station. You step inside to find about 50 men already there, older, thicker around the waist, but unmistakably familiar. The way soldiers recognise each other even after decades. The laughter is forced at first, too loud, as if to drown out what isn't being said. You shake hands, trade careful smiles. Someone claps you on the back and says, "You made it out too, eh?" The question means more than survival. It means you've learned how to live with yourself. Not everyone did. Here's a historical fact to anchor this haze of cigarette smoke and sentimentality. Through the 1950s and 60s, veterans' organisations flourished across West Germany. The largest, the Verband der Heimkehrer, Association of Returnees, claimed over 1 million members at its peak. Their meetings became both therapy and propaganda, half support group, half lobbying arm for recognition and pensions. A brass band starts playing an old marching tune. The melody once meant pride, now it just feels like echo. You raise your beer, because that's what everyone does, but it tastes more bitter than usual. Someone proposes a toast to fallen comrades. The room stands, glasses clink. Silence follows. You look around at the bowed heads, realizing that each man is thinking of different faces, different sins. Later, conversation turns to the present. Pensions, politics, the Bundeswehr. One man brags that his son is a captain now. Another complains about the new uniforms. Too soft. A soldier should look like a soldier. Laughter rolls, uneasy but practiced. You sip your drink and listen, feeling the familiar rhythm of belonging you thought you'd lost. It's seductive, this brotherhood of ghosts, a quirky and very real detail. At many such reunions, veterans wore discreet pins, small enough to pass as decorative, but carrying unit insignia known only to insiders. A silent code, nostalgia disguised as jewellery. The past learning to accessorize. You find Ernst sitting alone near the back, rolling a cigarette. His hands shake slightly. You sit beside him, and he nods without surprise. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he says. "Neither was I," you reply. He lights the cigarette, exhales. "Do you ever think about it?" he asks. "Every day," you answer. Neither of you specifies it. The historian in you, or maybe the survivor, knows what's happening here. This is the long arc of reconciliation bending inward. Men trying to edit their own memories until they sound like stories they can tell out loud. There's even a term for it in psychology, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the struggle to overcome the past. It's less about forgetting and more about rebranding. An open scholarly debate still circles these gatherings. Were they healing, or were they revisionism in beer mugs? Some scholars argue they allowed veterans to confront their trauma. Others say they sanitized it, turning guilt into nostalgia. Sitting here, surrounded by the hum of laughter and smoke, you suspect both are true. At some point, someone brings out a projector. The lights dim and old photographs flicker onto a sheet tacked to the wall. Grainy images of young men posing beside tanks, snowy forests, crooked smiles. The room softens. You watch your own 20-year-old face appear for half a second before the reel clicks forward. It's like seeing a ghost wave at you from another lifetime. Ernst leans over and whispers, "We were so sure we'd live forever." You nod, eyes fixed on the screen. "In a way we did," you murmur, a quirky slice of history from this era. West German television occasionally filmed these reunions as part of human interest programs. Viewers wrote letters afterward, some expressing sympathy, others outrage. "They look too happy," one viewer complained. Another replied, "They have earned their smiles." The debate played out like a national therapy session conducted via mail. The film ends, applause sputters. Someone suggests singing. The first verse falters, the second grows steadier. It's not the Forbidden War anthem, just an old folk song about home and rivers. You join in quietly, the melody thick in your throat. For a moment, you're not at a reunion. You're back on a night march, following the rhythm of boots and breath. When the evening ends, you and Ernst walk outside together. The air smells of rain and gasoline. "Will you come again next year?" he asks. You shake your head. "Once is enough." He nods, like he understands. You both know memory doesn't need annual maintenance. On the train home, you watch the countryside slide past in darkness. Villages rebuilt, fields tidy, power lines glowing faintly in the distance. Germany looks peaceful, almost innocent, like a well-behaved student hoping for a second diploma. But you can't help wondering how much of that calm is real and how much is practiced. You reach into your pocket and find the postcard again, edges worn soft. You think of writing back, something simple, like, "It was good to see everyone." But you don't. Some conversations are meant to stay unfinished. Back at the cafe, Lotta's asleep, a book open on her lap. You pull a blanket over her shoulders, sit by the window, and watch the street lamps haloed in mist. The city feels suspended, mid-breath. You realise that belonging and loneliness are sometimes the same emotion wearing different clothes. Tomorrow the cafe will fill again with customers talking about politics, the economy, the future. You'll pour coffee, nod, listen. The world will keep pretending the past can be boxed up in dusty halls with marching tunes and slide projectors. But tonight, as the first drops of rain tap the window, you close your eyes and hear that faint echo. The song, the laughter, the unspoken relief of men still alive. You don't smile, but you don't flinch either. Maybe that's progress. Maybe that's as close as anyone ever gets to peace. The rain doesn't stop. It trails you north, all the way up the coast, soaking the ferry decks, slicking the rails, blurring the horizon. You've taken a few days away from the cafe. Holiday, Lotta called it, though she knows you never go anywhere without ghosts as luggage. Your destination isn't a beach or a resort. It's a handful of forgotten fronts, the places that fell off maps while the world's attention stayed fixed on Berlin and Normandy. You start in Norway. The boat docks near Narvik. where the mountains still lean over the fjords like silent sentries. The air smells of iron and salt. Somewhere beneath these waters lie dozens of ships, German, British, Polish, locked forever in the cold. You remember reading that 300,000 Wehrmacht soldiers were stationed here during the war, left to garrison an edge of the continent that saw almost no action after 1940. When Germany surrendered, they simply waited for boats that never came. The locals still talk about them, quietly. One fisherman tells you over a mug of coffee that his father watched the grey columns march down to the harbour, their rifles stacked like offerings. They looked tired, he says, but polite. Some even said thank you. You nod. You can almost picture it. Uniforms frayed by boredom instead of battle. Men surrendering to an ocean that didn't care which flag they wore. Here's your grounding historical fact. At the end of the war, roughly 350,000 German troops were scattered across Scandinavia, the Balkans, and North Africa. Isolated outposts cut off by retreat and radio silence. Many surrendered months after May 8, 1945, unaware the Reich had fallen. Some never surrendered at all. They simply walked into the landscape and disappeared. From Norway, you head south, chasing rumours. In a Croatian village, you meet a priest who claims there's still a German bunker hidden under the vineyards. They left in such a hurry, he says, leading you down a narrow path. The entrance is half buried, the door rusted shut, but you can smell the damp metal and mildew. Inside, graffiti marks the concrete walls, names, dates, sketches of faces. Someone had written Heimfahrt bald? Home soon. You trace the letters with your fingertip, feeling the question still waiting for an answer. A quirky slice of forgotten history. In 1947, British engineers clearing the Libyan desert stumbled upon a German field hospital still operating 2 years after the war. The doctors and nurses had been treating Bedouin villagers in exchange for food. When the news reached London, one officer reportedly said, "At least they found a better use for bandages." You travel next to the Greek islands, following whispers of stranded naval crews. In Rhodes, an elderly woman sells you olives and tells you her grandmother once hid a wounded German sailor in the cellar for months after surrender. "He mended shoes," she says. "Good at it too." When you ask what became of him, she shrugs. One day he left. Maybe he went home. Maybe the sea kept him. The scholarly debates about these forgotten fronts are endless. Were those men deserters, survivors, opportunists? Some historians call them the last soldiers of the Reich, others accidental pacifists. You suspect they were simply men who ran out of maps. In a coastal bar, you overhear a group of divers discussing relics found offshore. Helmets, coins, even a watch still ticking when brought up from the silt. You think about the black market seller back in Frankfurt and realise time itself is the ultimate scavenger. It resells everything eventually. You end your journey in North Africa. The ferry to Tunisia smells of diesel and oranges. The desert heat presses against you like a wall. In the dunes outside El Alamein, you find the German war cemetery. Rows of flat stones, each marked with 2, sometimes 3 names. The sand shifts gently over them, as if the earth is still deciding whether to keep them. Here's a quirky fact that feels like poetry. Every year, Bedouin shepherds still bring fresh flowers to that cemetery. No one knows why exactly. Perhaps gratitude for medical help, perhaps respect for the dead. In this place, war seems to have dissolved into the dust, leaving only rituals of quiet maintenance. You kneel, brushing sand from one of the stones. The inscription reads simply, Ein unbekannter deutscher Soldat, an unknown German soldier. You whisper, "You're not forgotten," though you aren't sure who you're talking to, him, yourself, or the idea of everyone lost somewhere that isn't home. Historians rarely mention what came after for those left in remote garrisons. Many were absorbed into local economies, fishermen in Norway, labourers in Yugoslavia, mechanics in Egypt. Some converted religions, married, changed names. The world didn't welcome them back, so they built small, unremarkable lives where they were. Survival by camouflage. As the sun dips behind the dunes, the heat fades into cool wind. You stand, watching the sky turn from copper to indigo. The desert hums softly. No birds, no engines. Just the patient sound of sand shifting, as it has for millennia. You think, this is what the end of empire really looks like. Not parades, not treaties, just wind-erasing footprints. Back in your hotel, you jot a note in your pocket journal. Forgotten fronts are only forgotten by those who can afford to forget. You close the book, but the sentence lingers. The next morning you board a plane for home. The flight path crosses the Mediterranean, its surface glinting like a sheet of glass. You wonder how many stories sleep beneath it, how many ships, helmets, letters. The stewardess asks if you'd like coffee. You nod. When she hands it to you, the smell pulls you instantly back to Lotta's cafe, to the clatter of cups, the murmurs of customers, the living proof that some people do make it home. You sip, staring out at the endless blue below. For the first time in weeks, you feel the faintest pull of relief, not because the war is over, but because you've finally seen where it ended, and how quietly. The world doesn't collapse into peace, it just runs out of places to fight. When the plane dips toward the Rhine Valley, clouds part to reveal fields stitched with roads, rivers shining like veins. You think of the men still out there, under snow, under sand, under history, and hope they too found some version of this view before the end. The return flight from the desert leaves you drained but strangely restless, as if you've walked too far through memory to sit still again. Lotta meets you at the station, her apron still dusted with flour, her face framed by the same calm that's carried both of you through every new headline. She kisses your cheek and says, "You look sunburned." You almost tell her it's not the sun, it's the ghosts finally catching up to you, but you just smile instead. The next morning you find a letter slipped under the cafe door. The paper is thin, official, and smells faintly of dust. The return address reads Foreign Legion Recruiting Office, Marseille. You don't recognise the handwriting, but the name signed at the bottom makes you sit down hard on the nearest chair. Ernst, your old comrade from the reunion. "They take anyone," the letter says in its careful looping script. "No questions, no past, just a new name, a uniform and a paycheck. I'm going. Maybe this time we'll fight for something clean." You fold the letter slowly, staring at the neat fold lines as though they could reveal meaning. You picture Ernst's shaking hands lighting that last cigarette outside the beer hall. He'd said he was done with the past, but perhaps he just didn't know how to live without a war. Here's your historical fact to anchor this part of the story. After 1945, nearly 30,000 former German soldiers joined the French Foreign Legion. France needed manpower for its colonial wars in Indochina and North Africa. Germany had an army of trained men no one trusted. It was a grim kind of symbiosis, redemption repackaged as exile. The Legion's slogan might as well have been, "Forget your name and start digging." A few weeks later, the newspapers confirm what you already feared. German mercenaries die in Vietnam jungle. The article doesn't list names. You read it twice, trying to see Ernst between the lines. You can almost hear his voice saying, "At least it's warm there." A quirky truth. Some legionnaires never made it to combat at all. They were stationed in outposts that sounded romantic in dispatches, but were little more than mud and mosquitoes. Others fought in the hellish Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, where the French garrison was overrun after weeks of siege. Captured German veterans found themselves prisoners again, this time under a new flag, in another hemisphere. The cafe fills with talk of colonial wars. The customers debate whether France has gone mad, whether anyone ever learns. You pour coffee, listening to phrases like civilizing mission and anti-communism swirl together like bad sugar. It sounds so familiar. The rhetoric, the rationalizations, the idea that peace must always be defended by war. You can feel history reloading. One evening Marta stops by. She reads the newspaper over your shoulder and says softly, "They never left the battlefield, did they?" You shake your head. Some men don't know where else to stand. She sets down her cup and looks out the window. Maybe that's why I became a teacher. It's the only front line that doesn't bleed. The Foreign Legion becomes a kind of rumour that follows you. You start hearing fragments everywhere. A customer saying her cousin joined, a stranger at the train station with a French accent and a scar running across his jaw, stories of men who disappeared to the deserts of Algeria or the jungles of Indochina. They're like phantoms of an unfinished war scattered across continents, fighting for countries that will never pronounce their names correctly. Historians later call it the migration of militarism. The world wanted peace but couldn't quit the habit of uniforms. The Legion offered a strange compromise, redemption through anonymity. The French got soldiers, the Germans got oblivion. Everyone pretended it was voluntary. A quirky anecdote from the archives. One former Wehrmacht paratrooper who joined the Legion later wrote that the hardest part wasn't the fighting, it was answering to a new name. "They called me Henri," he said. When I died, it would be Henri on the cross, not me. Maybe that's a blessing. You wonder what name Ernst chose. You imagine him somewhere far away, boots sinking into red mud, stars so different from Europe's that they don't seem to belong to the same universe. You think about the way he had looked at that beer hall reunion, half proud, half lost. Maybe the Legion offered him something neither Germany nor peace could. Clarity. The cafe gets busier as summer approaches. American soldiers on leave from bases in Wiesbaden stop by for coffee and cake, laughing too loudly, snapping photos of everything. One of them leaves behind a paperback, For Whom the Bell Tolls. You flip through it late one night and find a line underlined in pencil. The world is a fine place and worth fighting for. Beneath it, someone had scribbled, but not twice. Lotta finds you staring at the page and asks what's wrong. You hand her the book. She reads the note, smiles sadly and says, "Maybe that's what Ernst forgot." Historians still debate the morality of those legionnaires. Were they mercenaries, lost men, victims of circumstance? Official France called them heroes when convenient, traitors when not. Germany, busy reinventing itself as democratic, pretended not to notice them. Even today, the Legion's records remain sealed under layers of bureaucracy and embarrassment. In the following months, letters arrive occasionally at the cafe. None are from Ernst, but they come from places you recognise from newsreels: Saigon, Algiers, Casablanca. Short notes written in stiff formal German, alive and working. The heat is unbearable. Or, we wear the same boots, just a different flag. You keep them all in a small tin box under the counter, each one a reminder that not every exile is physical. One evening, a storm hits the city, thunder rolling over the rooftops like distant artillery. You close early, standing by the window as rain slams against the glass. Somewhere out there, men are probably still marching, still firing, still convincing themselves it's for something noble. You think of Ernst again, and of all the nameless soldiers trading one desert for another. You whisper, "Enough," though you know the sky isn't listening. When the storm finally breaks, the air smells clean again. Earth, rain, faint traces of ozone. You open the cafe door, let the breeze in, and stand there for a long time, the tin box of letters still under the counter. Maybe tomorrow you'll write back to one of them, or maybe you'll let the silence do the talking. Sometimes absence is the only honest answer history deserves.